Hello, welcome to an overview of how to try Linux without changing your current OS. And what I hope to accomplish here is to help you discover Linux without damaging your current operating system, and how you can decide which distribution to use and which desktop environment you like, and then how to test it in a non-destructive way. The things I plan on covering here are introducing the concept of virtual machines with VirtualBox, how to choose a Linux distribution and a desktop environment, how to download the installer ISO file, creating the virtual machine, setting up the virtual machine after you've created it, running it, and then the next steps after you've done some testing. If you'd like to then move on to writing the ISO to USB or DVD to try on your computer, how to boot that image, and then taking the plunge whether you plan to dual boot or completely replace your existing system, and then some resources that I cover in this presentation. So the safest way to possibly test something in terms of an operating system is as a virtual machine. There is a free open source software available called VirtualBox from Oracle, which lets you simulate an entire computer from your existing system. So it just runs as an application on your desktop, and it simulates a computer and lets you install an operating system or running an alternate operating system without damaging or touching your system whatsoever. So according to Oracle, VirtualBox is a powerful x86 and AMD 64, Intel 64 virtualization product, and it is used in the enterprise as well as home. And not only is it extremely feature-rich, high performance, and professional solution, it's also freely available as open source software, which is an amazing thing that they do. I use VirtualBox quite a lot, pretty much on a daily basis, to test different Linux distributions in a non-destructive way. This will let you do the same thing on your computer. It's available for Windows, Mac, and Linux. So it's the same system across all those different platforms. And so if you're using it on Windows or Mac or Linux, you're going to have a similar experience. This is the VirtualBox website, and if you were interested in downloading it, you would come here and there's a gigantic download option right there in the middle. You would pick which platform you're on, if you're Windows, OS 10, or Linux. And this is going to give you, if it's Windows, it's going to give you an executable that you would install on your system, and then that's going to give you the application that you can then run. If it's OS 10, then you're going to get the DMG file to do the same thing. And a Linux distribution, most Linux distributions package it in their own repositories, so you generally don't have to come here and download it, but you can if you would like to. The only other thing I will mention here in terms of downloads is there's an optional extension pack, which adds some support for additional things like USB 3 and some other things that really I think most people probably don't use on a regular basis. But if you do find that for whatever reason you want to plug devices in, you can actually bridge the device from your physical computer to the virtual machine. So if you wanted to test a piece of hardware, you could try that. Although I'll tell you that virtualization is not the same as what you'd call bare metal or hardware. It's an emulation of hardware. In some cases, just because something works in a virtual machine doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work on real hardware. What you really should be looking at when you're using a virtual machine is more around what is the distribution, what does it give me in terms of the tools, which desktop environment do I have, what software is involved, and I'll cover that a little more as we get into this. That's really the point of a virtual machine, is not necessarily to run a system with full compatibility, but it is a good way for you to test whether or not you want to use this particular distribution, desktop environment, something like that. So how do you choose a Linux distribution? Because there are literally hundreds of Linux distributions to choose from. And my suggestion is that you stick with a major distribution, preferably one geared toward newer users. And there are, even in that category, there are still dozens available. But what I will say is that Ubuntu is certainly the most popular and widely used Linux distribution, period. It's what comes on, if you were to buy Linux hardware, a computer with pre-installed operating system. In most cases, Dell, Lenovo, major hardware manufacturers will use Ubuntu because it is the most widely supported and most widely used. And so it's kind of hard to go wrong with it for that simple fact. And also because it is so widely supported, if there is software that you are looking to use, whether that's an open source project or even proprietary software, if there is Linux support, it's almost certainly going to support Ubuntu. There are some exceptions to that, but in 99% of cases I can think of, there's going to be a DEB package, a deb package, which is an Ubuntu or a Debian-based package that you'd be able to download and install on your system and have just work the way it should. So in terms of ease of use, compatibility, support, Ubuntu is really going to be your best option as a new user. Now from there, all of those other options are out there, and there's OpenSUSE and Fedora and Arch, and there really are a variety of different distributions that all have their strengths and advantages. The trick as a new user is it's not worth getting hung up on all of those differences between them to start with, because really what you're interested in is, can I run Linux on my system, and can I get the things done that I need to do with Linux? Once you get into it, if let's say you take that path from there, then you can investigate all of those different options and the choices you have and decide whether or not you want to try something else. And again, if you're using VirtualBox, you could just download the ISO file from whichever distribution you want to try and spin it up and give it a shot. And even that's on your Windows desktop, your Mac, or your Linux desktop. VirtualBox is going to let you do that no matter what. The other thing I'll say is, because Ubuntu is so widely used, it tends to have very good hardware support, even for hardware that might be more difficult to use on other Linux distributions. And an example of that is my Dell XPS laptop has NVIDIA hybrid graphics. And on Windows, the NVIDIA driver lets the system switch between the discrete NVIDIA GPU or graphics processor and the onboard or integrated GPU. And the advantage of that is for power saving, and suffice to say, it's a slightly more complicated hardware setup than just having a single video card. So on Linux, Ubuntu gives you an option to switch between them. It's not as seamless as Windows, where it will actually switch between them automatically. Not yet. That's actually coming soon. If you're running an Ubuntu-based distribution, you're going to have the advantage of that hardware support, where in most cases, the hardware you have is just going to work. One of the big differences between Linux and Windows, and even Mac in some cases, is Linux has drivers for all of the hardware built right into the kernel or the underlying operating system itself. So understand that every distribution is sitting on top of the Linux kernel, and the kernel itself is Linux. And then the distribution is a set of packages and configurations that run on top of that kernel, and that includes the desktop environment and all of the other sort of services and things that are running in the background on your computer. But Linux itself, that kernel, has all of those drivers built into it. And in most cases, when you plug something in or you install it on a computer, it knows what to do automatically, and you don't have to install drivers. That's not universally true. There is specialty hardware that hasn't been addressed and added to the kernel. But by and large, for the most part, that's one of the advantages that I've personally seen using Linux as opposed to using Windows, where if I have a piece of hardware, in almost every case, Linux just knows what to do with it without me having to go find a driver on some random manufacturer website and hoping it's the right one, or maybe my PC manufacturer's website and hoping it's not 5 years out of date, as is usually the case. I'm a little off track there, but I just thought as I'm going through here, I would introduce some concepts to people who maybe don't understand the key differences between Linux and other operating systems. So other thoughts on Ubuntu, the idea of flavors and Ubuntu derivatives. So Ubuntu itself comes as a single distribution. If you just go and say, I want Ubuntu, then you're going to get Ubuntu, and it has the GNOME desktop environment, which we'll get to in a second. And it has some customizations on top of that, and it's sort of the standard Ubuntu distribution desktop experience. There are many choices for desktop environments in Linux, which is a difference between Windows and Mac OS, and I'll get into that in a second here. If you wanted to use one of those other ones, instead of trying to install it on top of Ubuntu, what's happened is that there are people who have created flavors or variations of Ubuntu, which are based around a different desktop environment. So for example, there is a KDE Plasma desktop environment, which is an alternative to GNOME, and the Ubuntu version for that is called Kubuntu. It has a K in the front. There are also distributions for XFCE, which is Xubuntu or Xubuntu, Ubuntu Mate, which is another desktop environment. Really, the list goes on. And if you don't want to deal with any of that, if it's just too much to, wrap your head around to start with, then the regular Ubuntu is perfectly fine. It's going to be a little different if you're coming from Windows, but most people kind of get it because everything you would expect to be there is there. There's a launcher, there's a taskbar, there's all of the normal stuff you would expect, but it's just in a different layout. So the other concept is an Ubuntu derivative, or derivative of any distribution. So there are derivatives of Arch and derivatives of other distributions as well. The Ubuntu derivatives are not directly tied to Canonical, who's the company behind Ubuntu. They're not officially supported, but they use the Ubuntu base. So they inherit all of the strengths of Ubuntu while being able to customize the desktop environment and packages that are installed and a lot of different things that they have flexibility and control over, but you have the advantage of that strong base of Ubuntu with those customizations. And some things come to mind like Linux Mint. Linux Mint is a good beginner distribution because they do a very good job of guiding you through using the system. When you first log in, it takes you through different steps of setting up the system, setting up the updates, setting up backups, and all of the sort of key steps that you need to take whenever you're getting familiar with a new system. And they do a very good job of that. And it is based on Ubuntu. Again, you're getting that Ubuntu base with their customizations on top of it. Zorin, Zorin, is another good example of this, where it's a very customized, very pretty desktop that is based on Ubuntu, but they themselves have done a lot of theming and a lot of different things, tweaks to make it look different. Elementary is another good example where they've done exactly the same thing. And the list goes on. So as you sort of investigate different distributions, and the suggestion I'll make is there's this website called DistroWatch, and I'll link to it at the end, where you can go and just see all of the myriad choice of distributions that are available. And they have a popularity list, which really more or less just counts how many people are clicking or the traffic that's coming in and where that traffic's going, which distributions are getting the most eyeballs. So it's not a direct indicator of like how popular a distribution is or how many people actually run that distribution. So don't get caught up in like the top results necessarily. But what it does give you is sort of a short list of these are the 10 or 20 or 30 of the hundreds of possible options that people have an interest in. And so it kind of gives you a little bit of a guide in sort of looking at different distributions. And the site itself has a lot of information around where it's based and how long it's been in existence and how often it's updated and things that might be important to you in terms of picking something. So this is DistroWatch. This is the main page. And you see here, there's a news feed in the middle. So if you happen to follow Linux and want to see what new releases are coming out, this is a great resource for that. And then this is the page hit ranking that I was mentioning before. So you see a list of what is considered to be popular distributions based on the hit ranking. And again, you can argue the validity of that, and a lot of people do, but my point is that, again, this is a sort of smaller list than the totality of Linux. The key point I'm trying to make here is that this just gives you an idea of what's available and what's out there to try. And so you may not want to limit yourself to just one distribution. So if you have a good enough internet connection and that's not a problem, then, why not try a few different ones? And when you go through creating the virtual machine, it's really not a big deal to just create multiples, and then you can actually compare them, which is a good exercise as well. So maybe have one distribution with one desktop environment and then another distribution with another desktop environment or another flavor or something like that. And that way you can sort of flip between them and say, well, how would I do this in this system versus that system? So the flexibility of using VirtualBox lets you do that. So don't limit yourself necessarily based on what's the most popular here or what you've read elsewhere. There are certainly options available to you, and it can be a lot of fun to experiment. That's one of the perks and benefits and attractions to Linux in general, is there's so much variety that it's interesting to try different things. You may not be that type of person. You may be looking at this from a completely practical standpoint of, I just need something that works, and that's perfectly fine. But it can also be fun to see what's new, what's different. Windows and Mac OS tend to be very glacial in their changes that they make. And for a lot of people, that might be an advantage. But what you find on the Linux side of things, and this isn't universal, but a lot of people, because Linux is changing so quickly in many ways, and not to say that to scare anyone, but Linux does have a pretty rapid growth and pretty rapid change in terms of releases and things like that. Not universally, but in many cases. You can choose what's called a long-term support release, where things don't change as much, and it's supported for usually like 5 years. You don't have to be part of that change if it's not something that is appealing to you. But if you're like me, and you like to see this evolution, these changes, then it can be a lot of fun to just come here and check it out, grab something and try it out in VirtualBox. The other thing I'll mention at this point is you don't want to take the time to invest yourself, set up your system in a smaller distribution and then maybe have problems with it and not be able to get support like you would want, or for whatever reason, the updates don't come out and they can't fix something, or there are a lot of distributions that are hobbyist distributions that are maintained by just a small team of people, maybe one person. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And some of them are extremely long-lived and well-maintained, but it's not a guarantee. And so as a new user, again, something like Ubuntu makes sense because it's been in existence for quite a while now. It's backed by a very strong corporate entity. It's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. So one of the other key differences of Linux is the choice of desktop environment. So unlike Windows and Mac OS, Linux users have a choice between many different desktop environments. And I've listed 5 here, which I personally consider sort of the mainstream, and even frankly, LXD and LXQT, maybe not as mainstream, but certainly well supported, especially on Ubuntu, which is the LXQT version of Ubuntu. I would say the 2 largest are GNOME and KDE Plasma, and I just spoke them in a different order than I have them sitting there. But GNOME, because it's on Ubuntu standard, and that's what comes with it. If there were actual hard facts on like how many people use GNOME versus using Plasma versus using XFC or any of these, my guess is that there's a wider majority of people using GNOME than there are using Plasma or any of the rest of them. But secondarily to that, I would say Plasma is probably the next most popular. And I could be wrong there because XFC is also very popular and used in many, many different distributions. The difference between them really is KDE Plasma is very much the standard traditional desktop paradigm of a start menu or a menu, a taskbar. And if I jump out of this slide here, this is actually KDE Plasma. So this is a very standard experience to people who have used Windows 7 or 8 or 10 or any Windows, frankly, because this has always sort of been the desktop paradigm. And it's very flexible and allows you to configure the system in many ways that Windows never could or hasn't ever tried to support. And the flexibility and the configurability is also, it's sort of a blessing and a curse because to some people, it's a little too customizable. If you jump into the settings panel, it can be a little daunting to go through all of these different options. You can change look and feel and the themes and the cursors and the colors, fonts, icon. It goes on and on and on. And again, for someone like me, I love this flexibility and I love the ability to just change things the way I want it to be. And it really lets me own my system, lets me feel like I'm in control of it and personalize it, puts the personal into personal computing and allows me to use the system the way I want to use it. For other people though, that's overhead and complication and just it's more work than they're willing to do or interested in doing. Or the other thing is that they potentially don't like this more traditional desktop paradigm. That's not to say you can't change Plasma because it is so flexible, you really can make it look just like Mac OS, or you can make it look like, a Chromebook if you want, or whatever type of desktop layout you like. Plasma can do that, and it can do it actually pretty easily as well. Regardless of that, there are other choices because, like to have choice and like the idea that there are other options, and also different distributions come with different things by default. So KDE Plasma, GNOME, XFC, Mate, and LXDE or LXQT. There are others. Budgie is one that comes to mind. Pantheon is the desktop environment in elementary. So this is a short list, and I'm not trying to do a disservice to anyone I didn't mention here. I'm just more or less looking at this from a new user's perspective, saying, what would I be looking at if I just came to look at Ubuntu, or if I went to OpenSUSE, or I went to some other distribution? Like, what do I get out of the box? And in most cases, the supported or default is going to be those top 3, maybe the top desktop for. So how do you actually choose? Well, I've been using Linux for years. I've been using KDE Plasma for years. I've been using GNOME. I use all of these. There's another one I didn't mention here, which is Cinnamon, which is what comes on Linux Mint. And it's also a wonderful desktop environment that is very familiar, especially for Windows users. So how do you decide? Well, really, it's up to you. And that's the personal side of this, is you download a couple of different distributions that give you a couple of different desktop environments, and you fire them up in VirtualBox and you give them a try. And you will decide just through using it, what tasks do I undertake? Am I just browsing the web? Am I just moving some files around? Am I looking at pictures? Depending on what it is that you're doing, different desktops do it differently. They all do it very well. I will say that we are at a point now in Linux where there is a level of refinement and polish and usability and stability and all the ility words I can think of to describe where Linux on the desktop is today. And this is in stark contrast to a decade ago or more, and even in contrast to as recent as a year or two ago. The amount of effort that has been spent on making these desktop environments smooth and stable is really impressive. And much of that work is done by people working on open source, unpaid. They do it because it's a passion thing for them. They're interested in it. There are a lot of different reasons why they might, but Linux benefits from people's generosity with their time and their knowledge. And the end result of that is we're now in a state where you're spoiled for choice. It's almost hard to make a bad decision. And when it comes down to it, in many respects, you're deciding on minor details. And certainly for someone like me, who's a long-term Linux user, at this point, the differences between the desktop environments, they're becoming smaller and smaller with every passing release. To the point where a system that I wasn't comfortable with, I'm not a big GNOME user, but they've made so many improvements and so many refinements and have put so much thought into how someone would sit in front of the computer and use it that I don't have a fundamental problem using it the way that I used to. It really just works. And so I leave it to you to take the time to download some things, to run them in a virtual machine, to decide what works best for you. And just know that you aren't limited the way you would be in Windows or Mac to whatever ability that they give you to change things within a very walled garden. I'm including an article in the resources that covers, it's a best of list, and I know sometimes these can be a little tedious, but I think this one does justice to the desktop environments that are available, the strengths of them, and why you might choose one over another. It's going to list out all of the desktops that I've mentioned and give you some pros and cons, and maybe just be a little bit more of a in-depth resource than what I've been able to cover here. Or if before you want to commit to downloading 2 gigabyte ISO file, you want to do a little more research, I think this is a pretty decent article that gives you at least a short overview of each one. It doesn't go into great depth, but it's at least touches on all of the key factors between the different desktop environments. So once you've decided what to download, you would go to the distributions homepage and find their download link. What they're going to provide to you is an ISO file, which contains the installer. And in most cases, it also has a live environment, which lets you boot to that ISO file and run it without installing it. So it's essentially just running right from that file instead of needing to be written to the disk with an installer and then running it. As I mentioned, the files usually start around 1 gig in size. The average size right now for most distributions is between 1 and 2 gigabytes. If you get a full offline installer, and what that means is that there won't be any need to go out and download any additional files either as the system's installing or after installing. Those can be larger, 5, 6, 7, 8 gigabytes. Depends on what distribution you're looking at and which distribution you're going to download. If it's any of the Ubuntu variants and flavors, most of those are in the 1 to 2 gig range, right around 2 gigs usually. And once you download that file, you can use it with VirtualBox as is. So what you'll do, and we'll go through that in the next step, is to create the machine and then you just attach that as a file to the machine as though it were a virtual CD drive or something like that. And then it will know to boot to it and use that file as the installation or live media. Once you've gotten past that and you maybe want to try it on your computer, which is also coming up, you can write that to a thumb drive or a DVD, and then that's what you would use to boot your computer. So that ISO file is really the distribution. That is what's giving you all of the content of that distribution, the installer, and the live environment. And a live session, as I mentioned, allows you to use the system as it allows you to boot to that file and use the computer as though it were installed. And the advantage of that, there's a couple really. One is that it runs in a non-destructive manner. However, you can still mess things up, and it's not as easy to do. It's not going to do anything by itself. So if you boot it, it's not going to write itself to your disk or anything like that without your intervention. But what you could do is open up a file manager, and all of a sudden now you see your disks there, and you could go in there and you're going to be able to get to your files and do things on your system from that live environment. It's not completely isolated or away from your hardware. It's actually running on your hardware. So it's going to see your disks and all your devices and anything that's plugged in and all of that. Just know that it's not going to do anything by itself. But if you go in and you start messing around with your disks and things like that, you could write over files or delete files or make changes to your system that can impact your existing system, your existing operating system. As an example of downloading an ISO, if I come to Ubuntu's homepage here, I see the download option. And it's going to give me a couple of different options in terms of what to download. And if you're looking for Ubuntu, just stock Ubuntu, if you remember earlier, I mentioned the concept of an LTS or long-term support that's supported for many, many years. In this case, it's 5 years. Or there are point releases every 6 months. And so right now, the current point release is 1904. The difference between these is the LTS version is fixed, meaning that when it was released, they had a set of software and packages and sort of a state that the system was in that was there for release. And over time, the only things that they tend to update are security updates. So if there's any kind of software that needs a security update in order to keep your system safe, then they will roll those out. But in terms of if there's a new version of a certain program, they're not going to include that new version in the long-term support release. To some people, that's a detriment because they want newer software. And there are some ways around that. There are package formats, things called snaps and flat packs and app images. And I'm not going to go into great detail here, but there are ways to bridge that gap and use newer software on a long-term support base. But if you wanted to have more up-to-date software, you could go with the point release. So in this case, on my system, I'm running Ubuntu, and I'm using the 1904 release, which is the current release available because I want the newer packages. I want the newer software. I want the newer version of Plasma. I want the newer sort of things. I want all of the newer stuff. It's not unstable. There's no reason that you can't run these point releases. They're well supported. They are maintained. And it's not as though they're treated any differently. But what can happen on the newer releases is new packages can be updated and new things can be changed versus that LTS structure of not changing things purposely. So let's say for the sake of argument, you want to do the 1904 release. You are going to come into this page. And I don't mean to belabor this point or make it too technical, but it is important for you to know what kind of system you have. If it's a much older system, it's possible that it's a 32-bit system. And if that's true, Ubuntu is not supporting 32-bit anymore as an install base. So there are distributions that do support 32-bit, and you would want to find one that does support your architecture, your CPU architecture. I'm going to guess that 99% of the people watching this are using a computer that was built in the last 10 years, and therefore almost certainly has a 64-bit processor. But just know that that is a possibility that your system is not. The other thing is there are systems like Chromebooks and other types of computers that use an ARM-based processor. So there are different processor architectures, and distributions will, in many cases, provide separate files for those specific architectures. So depending on your system, most cases, you're going to be fine with this, but you may need a different one. I would just download this file, and then I would end up with this ISO file. And from there, we would go on to the next step. Now we actually get to create a virtual machine and put all of this time and effort you've put into investigating different distributions and desktop environments. Now you actually get to use it. So let's have some fun with this. You create the virtual machine. So you've opened VirtualBox and create a new virtual machine, and you follow the steps to choose a name, a type, a location of your machine. Normally, when you name the machine, I don't know how you plan on naming things, but I would suggest you just sort of use the name of the distribution, because if you do that, VirtualBox knows what type you intend to install, and it's matching the type of the Linux distribution to the internals of the application and how it handles things and optimizes and runs. And so if for whatever reason you don't use a standard distribution name and it can't match that for you, you can set it. And I'll show that here in a moment. Then you also want to allocate resources for your system as part of this setup process as well. And that means giving it memory and giving it hard drive space. So most distributions can run with around 1 gigabyte of memory, but it's going to be very close and it's not going to be a great experience. So the bare minimum that I would suggest that you give any distribution is 2 gigabytes of your memory. Now, if you only have 4 in your system or 8, depends on how old your system is, how much memory you have. So you have to be careful not to give it too much because you can cause problems on your system with swapping, using the page file in Windows and virtual memory. So the performance of the virtual machine itself is going to depend on your underlying system. And if your system is not particularly fast, or if your disk is slow, or if your processor is older, or you don't have a lot of memory, then the virtual machine itself only has those resources to draw from. So you may not end up with a very smooth experience because of not having resources. So depending on your system, I'm going to say you have a relatively modern system. You have 8 gigabytes of memory. You are perfectly capable of giving between 2 and 4 to a single virtual machine, provided you're only running that machine and not multiples at the same time, because it's going to add up. So if you have 2 virtual machines with 2 or 4 gigabytes of memory running, you're going to have 4 or 8 gigabytes of memory taken up as they're running, in addition to your underlying system, which is already using some of that memory. It's a little bit of a math game, but you just need to figure out, okay, if you're on Windows and you open Task Manager, it'll actually just show you how much memory you're using now and how much is available on your system. So let's say you have 8 and you're using 3 of it. You would be safe using, between 2 and 4 for a virtual machine. That's not going to impact your system or cause any problems. But if you only had 4, you might have to be really careful or have closed down other applications that might be using memory. So not to get too far in the weeds here, I just want you to understand that the virtual machine itself, again, is drawing from the resources of your system, and depending on your system, that's how you decide what to give to a virtual machine. This is VirtualBox. And I'm going to create a new machine and just basically take you through the steps that are in the slide so you can see it in practice and see what I mean by the naming and things like that. So if I click new, here's where I'll put in a name for my system. And again, if I just put in Eric's PC, you see that it defaults to Windows or Microsoft Windows and Windows because it doesn't understand what that potentially is. But if I put in Ubuntu, it knows that that's a Linux type, and the version is going to be Ubuntu 64. I could leave it as Eric's PC and then come down and switch those manually. It's not a problem, but just know that you have to pick both types anyway. To be a little more descriptive, I'll go ahead and name it something like Ubuntu Testing, and it's got the type selected and my version selected for me. I click next, and here is where it's asking me how much memory. So again, depending on your system, what you would want to allocate is up to you. And it does actually give you a little scale here. It's smart enough to know that if you, in my case, I have 16 gigs of memory, and it's giving me sort of a colored scale here of where it thinks is safe to set this. Now, I normally, because I have enough memory, I will normally set it to 4 gigabytes of memory, and 1024 is 1. So 4 gigabytes is just the multiple of that is 4096. You don't have to be that precise at all. That's just me being silly. But so you would set it to whatever you're comfortable with here. Click next. The other thing is you can always come back and change these values. That's the next part of this, is we're actually going to go in and change settings. So even if you set something here and realize that later you needed to change it, you can do that. It's not a big deal. All right, so we allocated memory, and now what we need to do is give it some disk space. VirtualBox does a cool thing where it will use dynamic storage, meaning that it's only going to use as much of that as it needs. You can allocate, let's say, 20 gigabytes to a virtual machine. It's only going to use as much of that file as it needs. So you may, even though you set it as 20 gigabytes, what you may end up with is it's only using 8 or 9 or 12 or some amount of that 20, but not using the full 20. So that's actually a really cool feature. The trade-off you make there is that the disk access is a little bit slower. So a fixed disk size, and this is particularly true if you're on a spinning disk, if you're not using a solid state drive, you will have better performance with a fixed disk than you will with dynamic on those slower disks. So if your computer does not have a solid state drive and you're doing this testing with VirtualBox and you're just having a bad time of it because it seems to be really, really slow, this could be potentially one of the big factors in that performance. So if that's the case, what you'll want to do is when you create your virtual machine to set it to the fixed size. And the difference here is that instead of just creating a file that it will then fill up as it needs, it's going to allocate all of that space at one time. So if it's 20 gigs, it's going to take that chunk and write it out as a big chunk. And sometimes it'll take a couple minutes to actually do that from this point. So if you hit fixed and then click next, it may take a few minutes to allocate that space because it's just writing a big file at that point. In my case, I have a solid state drive. If you don't have a solid state drive, I will tell you that is the single best upgrade you can make to your system. You will get an amazing boost in performance from a solid state drive than over any fixed drive. The cheapest SSD that, if you were to go on Amazon and find like literally the, $50 128 gig SSD, that cheap SSD is going to be worlds faster than the best spinning disk. So if you are running a system with a fixed disk and you have the interest or ability or whatever to consider that upgrade, I highly recommend it because you will not regret it. All right, in my case, I'm going to use dynamic. So I'm going to give this 10 is enough for testing for most people. But if you have the space, I would say 15 is pretty much where you want to be at a minimum. And what I normally give is about 20 for mine. And all that really gives you, so again, if you're using dynamic, it's not using the space until you actually use it. It's not impossible to resize the disk after the fact, but it's just easier to give it more upfront. You may never use it, but it's not going to be a detriment to you. I would say maybe the biggest trade-off here, the biggest decision might be if you have a small disk, you don't have a lot of space, or you have an older hard drive, a spinning drive, and you're trying to make a fixed disk image, the time it's going to take to do that with a larger disk is going to take longer. If you're using dynamic, really no question about it. Just give it more space and it's fine. If you're using fixed, you may have to decide whether or not that makes sense for you. And again, you're not going to hurt anything. This isn't going to break anything on your computer. Play around with it, find the optimum settings for you. And if you find those settings, then you'll be able to run machines and it'll just work well with your system. And just know that the flexibility exists here to do different things based on your system. But I'll say that the happy path or the best possible solution is that you use dynamic size virtual hard drives and it just works very well that way. Once you've created the virtual machine, there are some settings that you need to change that the initial setup process for the machine didn't take you through. That was really just the bare bones of naming the machine, the type, the amount of memory, and the disk size. There's some other settings that we need to go in and look at. Those are things like for performance, if you have a multi-core processor, you can allocate more processors to the machine. So instead of being a single CPU process, I don't know how familiar you are in particular with CPUs and architectures and the idea of cores and how many threads and things can run. If you understand those things, then you know that the more cores and the more threads that a CPU has, the more things it can do simultaneously. So by default, VirtualBox is giving that machine one CPU, which means that it can sort of do things simultaneously, on that single CPU. If you have a system like my system has 6 cores and 12 threads, then you can allocate more processors to that machine and then have a better performance outcome because you're giving it more system resources. If that makes no sense to you, don't worry about it. One core, the way it is by default is fine. But VirtualBox helps you see what your system has available. And I'll show that to you in the demonstration portion. Display is definitely something you want to set because any modern desktop environment on Linux is going to expect 3D graphics as not necessarily required, but it's going to make the experience much more what you would expect to see on running it on hardware, right? So if you were to take that ISO and boot it either in a live environment or install it directly on your computer, what you're trying to do here is approximate it. And so you have to tell VirtualBox, hey, act as though you have a 3D graphics card, and here's the amount of memory you can use, and here's the display adapter, and maybe technical mumbo jumbo, but I'll show you the options to set, and you'll be fine. Storage, same thing. For storage, we need to actually attach the ISO file, the ISO file that we downloaded from the distribution website, and that's what the machine is going to use to actually boot up and get started, just as if it was on a USB key or a DVD for a physical computer. Make sure you select your machine that you created, click Settings, and from here, we would want to go to System, and this is where you see we had set the memory, and then you have some different options, and you can adjust this. Like I said, you don't have to get it right the first time. You can still come in here and change it. You can also change this at any time as long as the machine isn't running. So once you've installed, let's say you have given it 4, or maybe you have a ton of memory and you gave it 8, or whatever you gave it initially, and it's not running right. Maybe you gave it too little. Maybe you only gave it 1 and you should give it 2. Or in any case, you can come in as long as the machine's not running and change this, and then the next time the machine boots up, that's how much memory it'll use. So you can tune this as you go and as needed, and it will just work how you expect it to work. This is the processor section that I mentioned. And again, in my system, because I have 6 cores and 12 threads, it sees it as 12 CPUs. You may have a dual core system that shows up as 2 CPUs, or a dual core with hyperthreading where it has 2 CPUs but also has hyperthreading, so it shows up as 4 CPUs. You may have a more modern processor like I do and have a whole bunch of cores and threads. So because I have so many, normally I will give 4, and it's telling me, right, with this color, kind of stay within this range, because that's going to be the safe range. And so even if I just gave it an extra one, a second one, that would be a difference. But because I have so many, I give it 4. Does it make a world of difference? I'm not entirely convinced, but I feel like the resources are there. They're not being used. I might as well use them for this purpose. And so, hey, why not? The next part, and this is the critical video part, you see here the default settings are to not have 3D acceleration enabled and to only give it 16 megabytes of video memory, which is pretty puny. So we want to raise that to the maximum of 128. We want to select VBox SVGA as the graphics controller and enable 3D acceleration. And what this is going to do for our guest system, which is what you call an installed a virtual machine, it's a guest OS, is enable 3D graphics with a graphics controller and with enough memory to actually run the desktop environment to draw, all of the shadows and the transparencies and the things that desktop environments do. You can see the shadowing around this and the transparency when I move it. That's all being done by your graphics processor. The last thing we need to set here is the storage. And this is where we're going to attach the ISO file. This controller is simulating a CD drive. And so you would want to select where it says empty, and then on the right here, go to choose virtual disk file. And I'm guessing you're not going to have as many as I do. You probably just have a couple. But let's say I want that Ubuntu one. I would come in and find that ISO, click open. And then it's going to show you that it's here. And you'll know that this didn't work properly if you didn't set it properly when you go to boot the machine and it says can't find operating system or disk boot failure, and it'll be some esoteric message. But you'll know that that's what happened, and you can easily come back and change it. The other thing that's worth noting here is that once you've installed the system, if for any reason you ever need to come back and boot from the original ISO file, you can just do this same thing again. You can come back in and attach it, and then it becomes like, it's literally just as if you stuck a USB key in or stuck a CD into a tray and pushed it in the machine. That's what this is simulating. All right, so from here, this is the basic setup that you would need to go ahead and get started. So we'll move on to booting up. Our next step is to run the virtual machine. We're going to click Start to launch it, and it's going to launch a new window. And it's as if you're sitting in front of the computer's monitor. It's a virtual system and it's a monitor running within your computer and on your monitor, but the experience is that it's as if you are sitting in front of that computer's monitor. And depending on whether or not that distribution includes a live environment or if it goes straight to an installer, you're going to see one of those two things. Most of them are going to have a live session. It's going to boot to a desktop environment and you'll be able to interact with it and use it just like a normal computer and then choose to install it from there. But some of them do go straight to an install option. For example, Ubuntu gives you the choice. So it launches to a screen where it says boot to live environment if you want to go down that path, or just run the installer at this point because that's all I'm really interested in doing. So it's a decision point. That's going to vary depending on the distribution you choose, whether or not they go straight to the desktop, and whether or not they show a welcome screen and instructions on how to install, or there's just an icon on the desktop that, says installation. I will say that is definitely going to vary quite a bit between the distributions that you are downloading and trying. But in almost every case, they're either going to give you some sort of prompt as a welcome screen, or there will be a shortcut on the desktop to just run the installer. All right, so we have created the virtual machine. We have gone into settings and changed everything we needed to. We attached the ISO file. And so now we can go ahead and start. And keep in mind, this is running from a compressed file. That ISO file is actually a compressed format, and it will take a second to read it, load it up. It's actually a fairly large file as well. Okay, so this is what I was mentioning earlier, where it's going to give you a choice, and this is going to vary by distribution, and as I mentioned, but in this case, Ubuntu is saying you can try it or install it right from here if you prefer not to try it first. I'll go ahead and try it. And here we are on the desktop. And as I mentioned, there is an install Ubuntu right here from the desktop. There's no welcome screen. Some distributions, as I mentioned, would have a welcome screen here. And if you would prefer to test it out before installing it, this is the live system, like I said. So it's going to have, so it's running as a full system, and you'd be able to come in here and try out any of the applications you'd like to try before you commit to installing it. But again, this is just a virtual machine, so we're not really going to hurt anything by doing that. And so we'd want to start the installer, and I will show just the beginning part of this. And this is the Ubiquity installer that Ubuntu provides. There are other installers out there, depending on the distribution. You'll see Calamares and some other popular installers. They'll basically do the same thing. They're going to take you through selecting your language and your locale, where you want to install the system, any options you might want to have, creating a user, things like that. So I will just step through this. I'm not going to take a ton of time to explain everything, but you will probably want to install third-party graphics software and hardware. So this is additional drivers, closed source drivers. Most Linux distributions prefer to ship with just open source software. So software that isn't encumbered by either patents or isn't proprietary and closed sourced. Not all of them. Some of them certainly do that as a convenience to their users and where it makes sense. In particular, things like video drivers. The NVIDIA drivers for your graphics card, if you have an NVIDIA card, are closed source proprietary drivers. There is a open source driver available called Nouveau, which will give you a compatible system, so you'll at least be able to run it, but you won't be able to get the full graphics power out of your card without installing the NVIDIA drivers. So that's what they're offering to do here for you, is to install those graphics and Wi-Fi drivers, any of those proprietary drivers, as well as supporting additional media formats that are patent encumbered. So MP3 used to be an example of that, but the patent actually it's now an open format. But there are other formats that are not open, that if you have a file, you're trying to play a video or a particular audio or something like that, you might need that codec to run it. Not trying to get too much into depth on technical details, but that's why you, in most cases, will want to install that. The other option here is between a normal and a minimal. The difference there is that normal is going to give you a bunch of software. So when you saw I came in here, there's a lot of stuff installed by default. If you choose the minimal option, it's just going to give you a very bare system, which some people might prefer because they don't want all of that other stuff there. As a new user, just stick with the normal installation because they're going to give you one of everything. They'll give you an Office suite, they're going to give you a web browser, email client, all of the software you would need and expect to have on a system to do day-to-day types of tasks. So go ahead and leave that at normal. You want to download the updates. Unless you're offline, you could use this offline. And let's say your Wi-Fi couldn't connect to it or you don't have a connection. You don't have to download the updates. You can always do that later when you have a connection. So I will cover this in a little bit in terms of if you are doing this for real and you're putting this on your physical computer, what would you want to do with this setup, with this disk? Now, if you have Windows installed, it's going to see that and offer you the option of resizing your Windows partition to make room for Ubuntu to dual boot, meaning that when you start your computer, you'll be presented with a menu where you can select between Ubuntu or whatever distribution you're using and Windows. So that means that Windows is still on your computer and you can get to it, but you're booting into one or the other. And if you're familiar, Mac OS has a similar thing called Boot Camp where you can actually run Windows on a Mac PC with Boot Camp, and it's a very similar thing. It says when you're starting up, you can choose which one to run. So that's what this is offering. It's not doing it here because there's no other operating system installed. This is just the stock VirtualBox disk with nothing else in it. If there was something here, you would see that option. Because this is a virtual machine and we are dedicating the entire system to it, we want to just erase disk and install. We'll choose that option. And it will warn you. So as I mentioned earlier, in a live environment, and particularly obviously when you're installing, you can overwrite your data. You can erase your disk, which if you don't have backups could be a bad thing. I'm going to cover that in a little bit, but just know that a live environment, when you're not messing with your disks or files, it's not going to do anything to your system. But as soon as you start taking actions like running an installer or going and looking at your disk, so if I were to come in here, I could actually see that there would be a disk available for me to click on, and it would be either your Windows partition with your files and everything, which is an advantage, actually, not to go off on a tangent here, but one of the things that Linux is particularly useful for is, let's say your Windows computer won't boot for whatever reason, which it does happen. And if it won't boot and you need to get to the files, you can have a live USB key, a key with a live ISO image on it, boot up your computer and actually be able to get to the files from this session, from this live session, and then copy them off to another disk or go connect through a website and upload them to your cloud folders or whatever. So Linux as a recovery tool is a really great system, really great option for doing that. But I digress. We're going to say continue here. And it's going to go ahead and create the disks, set up the disk the way it needs to in order to install itself. And from here, you would select where you are. It should know where you are, but if it doesn't, you can select the correct location. And your next option is to just put in your name. So I usually just when I'm testing, I put in the name of the distribution I'm testing and then a password. And whether you require it or not, I would always suggest leaving required on. Some distributions have it log in automatically. At a bare minimum on your computer, you want to at least have a password. So I'm going to say, yes, I want the password, continue. So what it's doing in the background is uncompressing all the files in this image, this big ISO file, this 2 gig ISO file that you downloaded. And it's writing all of those files out to the disk, the partitions it just created on your disk. And it's going to put them all in place and then run the configurations it needs to for this system. It's going to set up the booting of the system and other options, the user you just created, the location you set, all of those things. And so this part takes, depending on the speed of your computer, it's going to take between 10 and 30 minutes usually. Sometimes it can take less if you have a really, really fast computer, and sometimes it can take longer if you have a really slow computer. And it's also going to be slower in a virtual machine than it will be directly on your hardware. So if you're installing this in the virtual machine, it's going to take a little longer. And if you're on your actual computer, then it will do this more quickly. And also, as I mentioned earlier, things like the speed of your disk whether you have a spinning disk or whether you have an SSD, that's going to make a huge difference because it's writing a lot of data to the disk. And if your disk is slow, which most spinning disks are, and particularly in comparison to SSDs, then it just takes that much longer. I'm not going to record all of this part of it. When it's done, it'll just tell you it's done and do you want to reboot? And from there, I'll pick it back up. So I've rebooted after installing, and here's my login prompt for Ubuntu. And I'll go ahead and log in. And so now the difference here between the live environment and a fully installed environment or a fully installed system, the live environment was transient. It was for that session only. If you were to save a file, if you were to make changes to the system and then reboot it back into another new live session, you would have lost all those changes. So if you are testing and trying to set it up, maybe you changed some things around, you installed some applications and I don't know, set up Firefox the way you wanted it to be, whatever it is you did. If you did that in the live environment, and then shut down, you will have lost all of those changes, which obviously could be pretty frustrating if you didn't realize that. So definitely install. It's a virtual machine. It only takes 15 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever. And then you can come in and make all those changes and have them just stay there and be permanent so that you can come back and maybe try it again. And as I suggested before, maybe try a couple different distributions, try to set them up the way you like them and see if it works for you. And then if you go and try a different one, you can do the same thing and come back to the initial one and compare them. And this just really gives you a lot of flexibility to do that in a completely non-destructive way in this virtual machine. Now that you've had a chance to test at least one distribution in VirtualBox, where do you go from here? Well, you can repeat the process and test more distributions to find the one that suits you best, which is not a bad idea at this stage because why not take a little extra time and test the waters, see what's out there. The other thing you can do if you're happy with what you've tested so far is write the ISO to a USB thumb drive or a DVD, depending on how your computer would boot to it, and then go in on your computer and test it. I'm going to guess that most people will want to use a USB thumb drive and not a DVD. At this point, optical drives are becoming less and less common, especially in newer systems, definitely in laptops, but you may still have a DVD drive, and if you want to, you can certainly do that. If you do, use whatever software you have. Windows 10 provides a way to write an ISO file to a disk just as part of Windows, and there are usually other software that comes with the computer as well. If you are going the USB route, then I would recommend Balena Etcher. It is the company's called Balena, and Etcher is the product, but they name it. And you can download for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. And just like with VirtualBox, it has that consistent appearance and functionality across all desktops. There are tons and tons and tons of options for writing ISO files to a USB. You'll hear other names or potentially find other names like Rufus. I have had varying success with many of them, whereas with Balena Etcher, it just works. And it works every time, and it works well, and it's got a nice little UI, and it's just an easy program to use, and it's free and available, and why not use it? Okay, this is the website for Etcher. It will recognize the system you're running and give that to you as the default option, but you are able to select other options if you'd like. Let's take a look at Balena Etcher. See how this works. It's a very simple, straightforward process. You select the source, which would be your ISO image. And in this case, just pick Ubuntu because it's right there. If you have a USB drive plugged in, a thumb drive, it will recognize that. It will also let you change it if you need to, but it will recognize it and you could just use it. And then you would click flash, and that's going to write the image to the USB disk, and it'll shows you a nice progress meter as it's going. Then when it's finished, it'll tell you, and there you go. You'll have a bootable USB thumb drive that you can use on your computer. So to boot the USB or DVD on your computer, you would want to either insert it while it's running and then reboot. If it's a DVD, you definitely have to do that because you can't open the DVD tray with the computer off. So if you were to try to shut down and then do it, that obviously isn't going to work. If it's USB, you could shut down and plug in the USB and then turn the computer back on. In many cases, maybe most computers will recognize that there's a bootable format available, either as a USB or a DVD. So when your computer starts up, it will just recognize it and then boot the live session. If your computer doesn't recognize the fact that you've inserted the USB or a DVD, you may need to tell it to show you a boot menu so that you can pick it or choose from options while you're booting. Most computers are using F12 PCs, Windows PCs are using F12 for this. Mac is something different, and I apologize, I don't know what that key combination is off the top of my head. Once you hit that combination as the computer's booting, so in my case, I'll see a Dell logo. If I hit F12 and hold it down, then it will show me a menu listing the internal disk and then whatever media I have, if it's the DVD or a USB, and you can select it with the arrow keys and then hit enter and it will launch or load that bootable device. So in this case, let's assume it's the USB thumb drive. You'll see that it's usually the brand of the thumb drive, so a Kingston or whatever, and then it will boot through just as it did in VirtualBox, except that now you'll be running right on your computer. And once it boots up and you're in your live environment, remember this is not going to change anything on your computer at this point unless you were to choose to install or change files through the file manager and things like that. But you're free to use your computer as you normally would. And I would suggest doing things that you would normally do on a computer. Browse the internet, look at the software that's installed by default on the live image. Basically the same exact things you might have done in VirtualBox, but the difference here is that you're using this opportunity to test it on your own hardware. And so you're going to figure out things like, does your Wi-Fi work? Is your screen the right size? Does everything look right? So this is your opportunity to test it out and see how it now runs on hardware. So just make the most of it. And again, it is not going to change anything on your system unless you tell it explicitly to do so by either running the installer or opening the file manager and making changes to your disk. And just like was the case in the virtual machine, all of these changes are happening in that live session, and it is all temporary. You can reboot your computer when you're done testing and you'll be right back into your same old computer. So you'll have been able to test everything without making any changes to your existing system, and then decide at that point, is this something that I really want to do? And if you do, from here, the path that you would take is either to dual boot or to do a full install and replace your existing operating system. I think for most people, particularly as new users, it's not a bad idea to do a dual boot, because the advantage there is that you can use your computer as either a Linux computer or a Windows computer or a Mac computer and be able to then switch back and forth if you need to. What I find happens is that people will have a certain set of programs that they use on whatever operating system they're used to. And in most cases, you'll find either the exact same program or an equivalent program that does the same thing. And so you won't be missing anything. But in some cases, there is software that only runs on certain platforms, or more specifically, doesn't run on Linux itself. There are some ways around this. And as you maybe take time and learn more about some ways to run non-native applications on Linux, which is possible, using things like Wine, you'll hear WINE, Wine is an option. It's sort of a compatibility layer for Windows executables to run in Linux. And people have been using it to do things like run Windows software like games and other things. And it does work very well in some cases, but it's not universal. So having that ability to boot back to Windows, to run a program that you have to get a task done that you can't do any other way, particularly at first before you find another way to do it, is a strong advantage. And some people argue that it's a crutch and it kind of keeps you between two worlds and that you don't commit to one or the other. But honestly, from a very practical standpoint, you have to look at it in terms of your appetite for change and your ability to really give up and move away from things that you're used to in your current system. I don't necessarily think it has to be an all or nothing proposition. I think you can take your time with it and decide what's right for you and when it's right, and use Linux when you want to. And maybe you'll find over time that becomes your preferred system. It certainly has become mine, but it may not for you. That also leaves you the escape clause that if worse comes to worse and you absolutely don't like Linux and don't want to use it, you still have your existing operating system to fall back on. And the worst that's happened is you gave up a little disk space to try out Linux, and there are ways for you to remove Linux and get all your disk space back. I certainly, again, I'm not trying to dissuade anyone or encourage people to not use Linux. I think it's wonderful, but I also understand that it's not for everyone. If you're going through this and you're willing to do some testing and try it out, I give you credit and applaud you for at least recognizing that there are alternatives and ways to do things that aren't just the standard whatever came on your PC way of doing things. And so I think anything that I or anyone else would try to do to push you in one direction or another isn't really fair to you as a person, and that you need to make that decision for yourself. I really hope that this video gave you the tools to do some of this testing, to make the decisions for yourself, to try out Linux, to see if it works well, not only for you and the tasks that you undertake and the things that you try to get done on a computer and the way you use your system, but also your particular computer. There certainly are situations where some computers just are not going to run Linux well, or maybe they're not going to run a particular distribution of Linux well. So the ability for you to test and try things out, and the fact that Linux gives you so many choices and so many options and abilities to change the way that you use your computer, hopefully for the better. I hope that this gives you some insight into that, and that it encourages you to at least give it a shot in VirtualBox on your current system, just to see what it's about. And with that, I know this has been a very long video, but I appreciate your time watching this. I hope that this did help you. I encourage you to provide any kind of feedback to me that you feel I should know, whether this is helpful and whether it's something that you would like to see more of. I want to encourage new users to try Linux, but on their terms. I want to try to get people comfortable with the idea of trying an alternative operating system on their computer, and particularly, as is the case here, in a way that isn't going to disrupt what you do or cause any undue stress or difficulty in using your computer. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again soon.